very nice to see everybody turning out today, especially since I know at least some of you were walking the Caitlin end to end yesterday, so you wanted a little bit more walking, I guess. I'd like to welcome you to the second Historical Heartbeats lecture series for the year. And we're very pleased today to have a talk and walk with the esteemed Llewellyn Emery, who many of you certainly know as an excellent artisan or as a cedar craftsman. But he's also well known for his writing. And we know that he's the author of Face of the Pond and Nothing But a Pond Dog, The Fires of Pembroke, and the Fabian Diaries. So we're in for a real treat today with the talk and the walk that we're going to have. And this is actually the first annual Dr. Paulo Camarca-Fago lecture. And the committee, the Historical Heartbeats Committee, had decided that we wanted to honor Dr. Paulo by having a lecture that focused on some aspect of Bermuda's environments or natural history. And so we thought that this was a very appropriate one because there's sort of the social element as well. And so because this is a memorial lecture, I just wanted to begin by reading his bio for those of you who aren't aware of his accomplishments. So Dr. Paulo Camarca-Fago, whose birth name was Roosevelt Brown, was a civil rights leader, a political activist, a parliamentarian, an ecological engineer, and a United Nations NGO worker who used his voice and mind to initiate change and empower people in Bermuda and around the world. Dr. Paulo's philosophy in life was that one should always give back to society wherever they are, and this was evident through the contributions that he made at home and abroad. He was born in Bermuda in 1932 and attended the Howard Academy, run by educator Mr. Edward Dejean, who was influential in Dr. Paulo's development and who later became one of the 7 founding members of the PLP. In 1960, Dr. Paulo formed the Committee for Universal Adult Suffrage in Bermuda to address the issues of reform of the franchise. The work of this organization was directly responsible for the eventual passing of the Parliamentary Election Act of 1963. Dr. Paulo earned his PhD in ecological engineering from the California Institute of Technology in the United States and pioneered internationally recognized projects in rural development, organizing a number of international conferences on this subject, particularly with respect to developing and small island states. An academic of international regard, he taught all over the world, maintaining consultancies to governments and a number of international organizations, including the Commonwealth Secretariat and the United Nations Development Program. His achievements are legion and include head of International Network of Small Island Developing States of NGOs and indigenous people, United Nations Consultant on Rural Development and Renewable Energy Sources, 1981 Citizens Independent Medal for assisting the Republic of Vanuatu on the road to independence. In Bermuda, he was honored by the Anti-Apartheid Committee, the Friswell's Hill United Community, and the Bermuda Human Rights Commission. He died in 2007 and was named a Bermuda National Hero in 2011. So we honor Dr. Paulo Camarca-Fago today, and we have asked in the advert that everybody bring their own bottle, and you're welcome to refill your water bottles over here. And we have a few snacks as well, so you have some energy to take our 1.3-mile walk around the pond. And they'll also be here for you when hopefully we'll not be too exhausted coming back. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Llewellyn Emery, and thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted that we get a chance to do this again. I did it a couple of years ago and enjoyed it immensely. It was, for me, it's like just reliving my past, as I've done many times over just from writing. But to share it with others is especially enjoyable, and to familiarize you with some of the features of this area that are not generally known. It's known to those of us who grew up in these areas, but it's nice that there's a wider interest, so I'll be happy to share a few things along the way. We'll make a complete circuit of the pond, and when we get down to the entrance, we'll just give a brief Pond 101 lesson for everyone, just so that we know in what context the word pond is being used each time I say it, because that can be kind of confusing to some who are not from these environs. So I guess we can head out to the main entrance, and our tour will actually start right there with our first feature. Well, we're going to start our pond walk and tour from this point, and we're going to go clockwise around this entire circuit. Of course, we're at a slight disadvantage here because of the overgrowth of all of the vegetation right now. So you're going to have to use a little bit of imagination along with my efforts to try to explain to you some of these areas. Immediately across from us here was, as we would call it, the desert, which was literally a desert. I understand that this was a dump site at one time, and then once they closed it down, the earth was literally scorched to the point where nothing else could grow there. It was covered with gravel, and nothing ever grew there, and so it remained like desert land. But it was completely level, flat, and it was great for playing. They started actually a softball, informal softball games, and eventually men's and women's softball leagues kind of developed out of that and moved over to Devonshire Rec later on. But this was the birthplace for that. The neighborhood young men would come down here and pitch and hit their softballs out into the marshy areas. But nonetheless, that was one of the most practical uses of the desert that I knew of. And when the big guys were not there, the little ones could take over and play in the same areas. The marsh has various features to it, so I'd just like to explain to you a little bit about this whole idea of what we call the pond. Now, generically speaking, this whole area we call it the pond, right? So if someone says you're from around the pond, well, we know that you could be from anywhere from probably up Smith's Hill all the way over Friswell's Hill and probably over to Government Gate area. It's all the pond, okay? The pond can also mean literally the pond, the water, the ditch or the canal that runs from Mills Creek all the way through and out to here. We'll see that a little bit more clearly when we get a little bit closer. It was also called the pond. The marsh area itself is the pond. So if you're going to go to the pond, you would likely be going into the marshy areas of the pond back in those days, where the reeds and grew and where the frogs were plentiful in those days. The dump site, where at that time all of the island's garbage was dumped and burned or left to decompose, whichever. That was also the pond. So depending on how you use the word, you see, if you said you were I'm going to go over to the pond to get some baby carriage wheels, obviously that's where you're going, to the dump. Now, if you said, let's go looking for frogs out the pond, then you're probably going to go to the marsh. But if you wanted to say, let's go see if we can get some tadpoles or some mullets, then you were talking about in the ditch. All the pond, but context makes all the difference, you see. We always knew exactly which one we meant, so it wasn't a problem. Although these many years removed, it might be a problem for some. So as we go along here, I'll tell you a little bit more about this little interesting stretch along here. But just before we move, you should know that just west of the desert itself, bordering the desert on that side, was another interesting little geographical spot in the pond, in the marsh. We called it the jungle. It was literally a jungle. Small jungle, but it was a jungle. Very tightly grown groups of trees, tall trees, a couple of palm trees, and a few other species that I have no idea what they were, but it formed a jungle. It was like a maze in there. And we didn't venture in there too much. I don't know quite why, but probably just as children, there were probably all kinds of stories about how you'd never come out alive or something. It's gone now, so you won't have to even worry about that. And there were no wild animals there either. So, but it was called the jungle. I don't know how or why. I do know that Clifford Luby, who was once Mr. Bermuda, a bodybuilder, he actually made a film out there, a movie, Tarzan. He made Tarzan movies out there. I've been trying to get hold of him to see if I could see if he still has that footage and see it for myself, but I've been unsuccessful for years and years. I keep nagging him about that. But anyway, that will give you a little initiation into this area we call the pond. So I think what we'll do is cross the road onto this other sidewalk, and we'll continue along this stretch. And I'll tell you about this area, probably going back close to 100 years, when it was quite useful for something else. I won't say yet what it is. Yeah, today you probably make over 25 cents. Well, this will be a good place to just pause again and explain just one or two things. First of all, again, this was one continuously flat, leveled area. They've done a lot of dredging and widening here in recent times, so this little bit here is an extension. But beyond the desert itself, we started to get gradually bits of the marsh vegetation growing again. I learned from Mr. Daniels, who taught me my trade and a whole lot of other things. He lived up there in that peach color house right there. That's where his homestead is, where he grew up. But he said his father used to actually grow a particular cash crop in this marsh area, and it was not uncommon in Bermuda for a lot of the marshland to be used for that purpose. Believe it or not, they actually grew celery in this marsh area, just a natural place for it, with the overspill from the pond would always keep it irrigated. After heavy rains, a lot of this would be underwater, a couple of inches of water for days and days, nowhere for it to soak away. And so some years later, I would say probably, looking back now, it might have been about 20 years ago, I was walking through this area before it was all overgrown like it is, and I discovered there are still mounds of earth where obviously they had once had grown celery there. Bermuda exported many products right from here to the markets in New York. So Bermuda was considered like the greengrocer for New York City. And so there were a few crops that were actually grown here, and many families were involved in either picking and packing and carting some of these goods to the Hamilton docks, and then twice a month ships would sail from Bermuda to New York laden with produce from Bermuda. So that would be back in the late 1800s, and it's amazing how progressive we were back then in comparison to now. We were feeding New York, and we can't feed ourselves now. Now, over here, we get our first introduction to the pond, and you know by that we mean the ditch. As I mentioned, it's been widened considerably. I'm glad we're still able to get a peek at it through the brush here. But this was just a much narrower canal that ran this way. It actually continues under the street, and for a little bit of a distance down along where those blue apartments are, before it just fizzles out. That's it. I don't know what happens after that. I guess it just soaks, the rest of the water is just lying dormant underground there. But if we followed it westward, it would open up literally into Mills Creek and the Mill Reach area, and the Great Sound. But the ditch here was one of those forbidden playgrounds that could not be resisted, obviously, and perfect, just a little obstacle in the way of a shortcut from school to Parsons Road to home. By the way, speaking, we said we had many uses for the word pond. Parsons Road was Pond Road. For a long time, that's all we called it. Officially on the maps, it's